Mark Davis lived a simple rhythm in Denver, Colorado. Each morning, he opened the creaky garage door of his little shop on Main Street, the smell of oil and steel greeting him like an old friend. At 35, he didn't dream of riches or fame. His only pride was in the reputation he'd built. People trusted him. When others added hidden charges or unnecessary parts, Mark charged only what was fair. Customers often said, "He's not just a mechanic, he's a man you can count on." Yet, when he closed the garage each night, silence filled the small apartment above the shop. No family photos decorated his walls. No little voice called Daddy. He sometimes wondered if his life would always be just wrenches, engines, and empty dinners. But destiny often walks in disguised as trouble, and on one cold afternoon, it rolled up in the form of a tired old minivan. The van sputtered loudly, coughing with every turn of the wheels before jerking to a stop in front of his garage. Mark wiped his hands on a rag and looked up. Behind the wheel sat a young woman with auburn hair pulled into a messy bun, her face pale with worry. In the back seat, a little boy, about 7 years old, peeked nervously through the window, clutching a worn backpack. Mark could tell by the woman's anxious glance at the dashboard and her bitten lip that this wasn't just about a career, it was about survival. She stepped out, shivering in a thin coat, and introduced herself as Rachel. I need help. Please. The engine just gave out, and I can't miss work again." Her voice trembled as though every word carried the weight of a dozen hidden struggles. Rachel explained between hurried breaths that she was a single mom, juggling 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. The minivan was her lifeline. It carried her to work, took her son Ethan to school, and served as their only reliable shelter when money ran thin. She looked at Mark with apologetic eyes, almost as if bracing for rejection. "I can't pay you much," she whispered, "but if you could at least tell me what's wrong." Mark studied her for a moment. The grease on his hands didn't bother him, but the exhaustion in her eyes struck something deeper, something human, something familiar. He'd seen that same expression years ago in the mirror when life had knocked him down. Instead of discussing money, Mark simply nodded. "Pop the hood," he said gently, his tone more reassuring than transactional. Rachel blinked, surprised that he hadn't turned her away. Ethan leaned forward in his seat, curious but cautious, as though unsure whether to trust this stranger. Mark leaned into the engine, listening, touching connections, and running his experienced eyes over what others might have dismissed. His movements were slow and deliberate, not rushed. "Engines are like people," he often said. "You don't fix them by shouting at them, you fix them by listening." And that afternoon, he listened carefully to the voice of a failing machine that carried the weight of a small family's fragile hopes. Hours stretched into evening. Rachel sat inside the chilly waiting area with Ethan, who busied himself drawing on a scrap of paper with a broken pencil. She watched Mark work, his determination unwavering despite the dropping temperature and his obvious fatigue. Most men she had met either judged her, dismissed her, or saw her as a burden. But this man, with oil stains on his shirt and weariness in his eyes, worked with the focus of someone who cared not for profit, but for people. She found herself wondering who he was beyond the garage walls, and why he looked at her van as though it was more than just metal and bolts. By the time Mark tightened the last bolt and wiped the sweat from his forehead, the sky outside had turned dark. The engine coughed once, then purred smoothly, as though it had been given a second life. Rachel stood, her hands over her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. It's running," she asked, her voice fragile with disbelief. Mark gave a small smile, the kind that carried humility rather than pride. "She's good to go. Just needed someone to pay attention to what everyone else ignored." For Rachel, it wasn't just about a fixed van, it was about breathing again, about not losing her job, about not having to explain to her little boy why life had failed them again. She let out a shaky laugh, but her tears fell freely. Ethan bounded out of the waiting room, his small feet pattering against the concrete floor. "Mom, does that mean we can go home?" he asked eagerly. Rachel hugged him tightly, nodding, but when she turned back to Mark, something inside her shifted. The way he looked at Ethan with a softness he didn't even realize he had made her see him differently. For years, she had prayed for a miracle, not of money or riches, but of love, stability, and someone who wouldn't walk away. And in that moment, the words escaped her lips before her mind could stop them. With her voice trembling, she whispered, "Do you want to be my son's father?" The garage went utterly silent. Ethan tilted his head, confused, while Mark froze, mid-motion, still holding the rag in his hands. His eyes widened, searching Rachel's face for a sign of whether she was serious. She immediately flushed with embarrassment, realizing how it must have sounded, and opened her mouth to explain. But the truth was, those words had not been planned. They had come from the deepest part of her heart. A heart worn down by loneliness and the fear of raising a boy without a role model. And in that unguarded instant, Mark felt something stir inside him, too, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't pity. It wasn't obligation. It was the possibility of belonging. Mark stood frozen, her words hanging in the air like an echo he couldn't escape. "Do you want to be my son's father?" Rachel's cheeks burned red as she realized what she had just said aloud. She quickly shook her head, fumbling with her words. I didn't mean it like that. I was just overwhelmed. You've done more for us in a few hours than most people ever would. But before she could stumble further, Ethan tugged on her sleeve and pointed at Mark with wide, innocent eyes. Mom, he said simply, I like him. He's nice. That one sentence cracked something in Mark's chest, something long walled off. He had been many things in life: a mechanic, a friend, a survivor of loss, but never had he been someone's father. The title felt foreign and heavy, yet strangely comforting when it came from the mouth of a child. The following week, Rachel returned to the shop, but not for repairs. Instead, she carried a small paper bag of sandwiches and coffee. You've been working too hard, she said, placing it on his cluttered workbench. Mark looked at her, startled. People usually came to take, to demand, to argue over bills. Rarely did anyone come just to give. She smiled shyly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. It's the least I can do. Ethan darted in behind her, his backpack bouncing, his eyes lighting up as he spotted the shelves of tools and parts. Mr. Mark, can I watch you fix something today? Mark chuckled, nodding toward an old carburetor on the bench. Sure, kiddo, but only if you promise not to lose any bolts. Ethan grinned, saluting as though he'd just been enlisted for an adventure. As days turned into weeks, Rachel and Ethan became regular visitors. Sometimes it was for the Vanaways rattling in some new way, but more often it was just to bring a home-cooked meal, or to spend time, where laughter now seemed to echo as much as the clinking of wrenches. Ethan became fascinated with engines, asking endless questions. Why does oil smell funny? How come cars need batteries if they have engine? Could you build a car from scratch? Mark answered every question patiently, his rough voice softening as he explained, realizing he enjoyed teaching almost as much as fixing. For the first time in years, the grease on his hands didn't feel like a mark of loneliness. It felt like a badge of pride, especially when Ethan's little eyes followed him like he was the most capable man in the world. Rachel often sat nearby, sipping coffee and watching the two of them with a smile that grew warmer each visit. She told Mark pieces of her story, how she had been married young to a man who promised the world but left when things grew hard. She explained how she worked jobs waitressing at night and cleaning offices in the morning just to make rent and keep Ethan in school. Some days I feel like I'm barely hanging on, she confessed one evening, her voice trembling. But then I look at him, and I know I have to keep going. Mark listened quietly, his hands resting on a wrench, his eyes filled with respect. He had no judgment, only admiration for her resilience. You're stronger than you think, he said softly, words that made her blink back unexpected tears. For Mark, opening up wasn't easy. He had spent years burying his own pain, convincing himself that silence was easier than vulnerability. But Rachel's honesty drew something out of him. One night, after Ethan had fallen asleep in a corner chair, Mark shared his own story: the parents he lost too young, the relationships that never lasted, the emptiness of coming home to no one waiting for him. This shop, it's all I've had, he admitted, his voice low. Rachel reached across the workbench, resting her hand lightly over his grease-stained knuckles. Maybe it doesn't have to be all you have, she whispered. The warmth of her touch lingered long after she pulled away. Their bond grew in small, tender ways. Rachel started bringing dinner when her shifts ended late, and they'd sit on crates in the garage, eating together while Ethan chattered about school. Sometimes Mark would fix her van without even being asked, replacing worn parts quietly, refusing to take money. You need it more than I do, he would say whenever she tried to insist. One Saturday afternoon, he surprised Ethan by building a small go-kart from spare parts. The boys' laughter as he rode it in circles in the lot outside filled the air with a joy Mark hadn't felt in years. Rachel watched, her hands clasped to her chest, whispering, "You don't even realize what you're giving him." Mark only smiled, but deep inside, he knew he was receiving something too. The neighborhood began to notice the change. Customers passing by would see Rachel and Ethan at the shop and smile knowingly. "Looks like you've got yourself a family, Davis," one older man teased as he picked up his repaired truck. Mark brushed it off with a laugh. But later that night, as he closed the garage doors, the words echoed in his mind. Family. He had never thought that word could apply to him again. Yet every time Ethan ran into the garage shouting "Mr. Mark," or Rachel set a plate of food on his bench, the idea seemed less like a dream and more like a possibility. What began with a broken van had become something far greater. There were no grand gestures, no fancy dinners, no expensive gifts, just quiet moments of sincerity. Late-night talks over coffee, laughter echoing in the garage, the feeling of being needed not for what he could fix, but for who he was. Mark often caught himself staring at Rachel when she wasn't looking, the tired lines on her face softened by her smile, the determination in her eyes even when she was worn thin. And when Ethan hugged him unexpectedly one evening, calling him the best mechanic ever, Mark's heart swelled in a way he hadn't thought possible. He wasn't just fixing cars anymore, he was repairing lives, piece by piece, including his own. That Saturday evening felt different from anything Mark had experienced in years. Rachel had insisted he come over for dinner, brushing off his hesitation with a firm but kind smile. "It's just pasta and garlic bread. Nothing fancy," she'd said. But as Mark stepped into her small apartment, he felt the warmth of something far greater than a meal. The scent of simmering sauce filled the air, and laughter echoed as Ethan proudly pulled Mark toward the table. "You have to sit next to me," the boy declared, waving his school drawings like prized treasures. Mark chuckled, settling into the seat, realizing how natural it felt to be part of this little world. Rachel set plates before them, her eyes softening as she watched the two most important people in her life, one by birth, the other by unexpected gray share, a moment that already felt like family. Dinner was simple, yet it was the richest meal Mark had tasted in years, not because of the food, but because of the company. Ethan eagerly explained each drawing he had made, from a rocket ship blasting into space to a picture of Mom and Mr. Mark fixing the van. Mark laughed, his heart unexpectedly swelling with pride at being included in a child's imagination. Rachel leaned back, watching her son's joy and sneaking glances at Mark, her chest tightening with gratitude. She had prayed for years, not for wealth, not for luxury, but for someone who would love her and her boy with honesty. And here he was, quiet, kind, carrying his own scars, yet showing up for them in ways no one else ever had. She realized in that moment she didn't just want Mark in their lives, she needed him. Later that evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep with his drawings scattered across the table, the apartment grew quiet. Rachel carried the plates to the sink, and Mark instinctively rose to help. "You don't have to," she said softly. "I want to," he replied, rinsing the dishes while she dried them, the rhythm feeling like they'd been doing it for years. When the last dish was put away, Rachel hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she turned to him, her voice lowered, fragile yet determined. "That day, at your shop, when I asked if you wanted to be my son's father, I wasn't joking. I meant every word. I've been praying for someone who could love Ethan, who could love me. Not for what we lack or what we can't give, but for who we are." Mark froze, her confession sinking deep into his chest. His heart raced, the silence stretching between them until he finally stepped closer. He reached for her hand, his palms rough and calloused from years of work, yet gentle as they wrapped around hers. "Rachel," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "I don't have much. I don't have riches or a big house. All I've got are these hands and this shop. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be the man you and Ethan need." Her breath caught, tears brimming as she whispered, "That's all we need." In that fragile moment, two broken souls began to stitch a new life together, one thread at a time. From that night on, life changed, not in sudden, grand gestures, but in steady, meaningful ways. Mark became a constant presence in their lives. He would walk Ethan to school before opening the shop, listening to the boy chatter about superheroes and science projects. After work, he'd join Rachel for dinner, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just bringing himself. The three of them began to form routines: movie nights with popcorn, Saturday mornings fixing little things around the apartment, evenings filled with stories and laughter. For Mark, it was as though he had discovered a missing part of himself he never knew existed. For Rachel, it was as though her silent prayers had been answered in the form of a man who expected nothing but gave everything. The community noticed too. At church one Sunday, a neighbor leaned over to Rachel and whispered, "That mechanic of yours, he looks at you like you hung the moon." Rachel blushed, but she didn't deny it. Mark did look at her that way. He looked at Ethan that way too, like they were miracles he didn't deserve but had been blessed to receive. Even Ethan seemed to bloom under Mark's steady presence. His grades improved, his confidence grew, and he often announced proudly, "My mom and Mr. Mark can fix anything." Each time he said it, Mark's chest tightened with both pride and humility, realizing he had become a role model without even trying. There were challenges, of course. Money was still tight, and the future uncertain. Rachel worried about relying too much on Mark, while Mark battled doubts about whether he was truly enough for them. But each time fear crept in, they reminded each other of what truly mattered. One night, when Mark confessed his insecurities, Rachel cupped his face in her hands and whispered, "You've already given us more than anyone ever has. Your heart. That's worth more than anything." And when Rachel doubted if she deserved happiness, Mark wrapped his arm around her shoulders and said, "Everyone deserves love, Rachel, even us." As months passed, their bond deepened. Mark wasn't just a mechanic anymore, he was Ethan's mentor, Rachel's partner, and the cornerstone of a new family. One summer evening, while they sat on the porch watching Ethan play with his go-kart in the parking lot, Rachel leaned her head on Mark's shoulder. "Do you ever think about how all this started?" she asked softly. Mark chuckled, his arm tightening around her. "Yeah, a broken van and a desperate mom walked into my shop, and I thought I was just fixing a car. Turns out, I was fixing my own heart too." Rachel smiled through tears, kissing his rough hand. "Turns out, you were the answer to a prayer I was afraid to speak out loud." By the time autumn arrived, Mark's life looked nothing like it once had. The man who used to go home to silence now returned to laughter. The mechanic who thought he had nothing had discovered he had everything. A son who wasn't his by blood but by love. And a woman who saw his worth beyond the grease and tools. On Thanksgiving, As they sat together around a small but joyful table, Ethan bowed his head and said, "I'm thankful for Mom, and I'm thankful for Mr. Mark, 'cause now I feel like I've got a dad." Tears streamed down Rachel's cheeks as she reached for Mark's hand. And in that moment, Mark knew he had found his forever.